On a quiet winter night in 1964, the Jensen family of four sat down to dinner inside their modest farmhouse just outside Cascade, Montana. The table was set, the roast still steaming and the radio humming softly in the corner. Hours later, a neighbor passing by saw the light still on, but no one moved inside. When authorities arrived the next morning, the meal was untouched, the chairs perfectly in place. And every member of the family was dead. No struggle, no forced entry, no clear cause. To this day, what happened during that dinner remains one of Montana's darkest mysteries. The Jensens had never been a family that drew attention. In a town like Cascade, Montana, where everyone knew everyone else's stories 3 generations deep, their quiet lives earned them little more than a nod on Sundays and the occasional wave along the dirt road. Harold Jensen, at 56, had spent most of his life working the rails, a man of habit, his hands calloused, his voice low, always smelling faintly of oil and pine tar. His wife, Margaret, was his counterweight, steady, warm, with the patience of someone who believed deeply in the small rituals that held a family together. She taught Sunday school at the local chapel and was known for her rhubarb pie, which she baked faithfully every Saturday morning. Even through the bitter Montana winters, their children, Eleanor and Thomas, were the kind of siblings people envied. Close, well-mannered, almost unnaturally inseparable. They spent their afternoons exploring the ridges behind the farmhouse, chasing the wind through endless fields of pale grass, returning home with flushed cheeks and hands full of strange treasures. Smooth stones, bird bones, forgotten tools rusting under the soil. Their home stood alone on the prairie, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that looked out over the frozen plains. There were no fences, just an endless horizon that seemed to swallow the light each evening, leaving behind an ocean of silence. Life in that house was simple, perhaps even idyllic by the standards of the time. The Jensens kept to a schedule that barely changed with the seasons. Breakfast at dawn, Harold's shortwave radio crackling in the background with weather reports or distant voices from other towns, school lessons for the children, chores for Margaret, and by sunset the family gathered around the dining table, a large oak piece Harold had built himself years before. They prayed, ate, talked about the day's small victories and frustrations. Then, before bed, Margaret would read a passage from the Bible aloud while Harold cleaned his tools, the rhythmic sound of metal on cloth echoing faintly through the house. But those who knew them best began to notice small changes that winter of 1964. Margaret's letters to her sister grew shorter, her handwriting hurried, her tone uncertain. She began mentioning sleepless nights, the wind that seemed to whistle through the walls even when the air outside was still, and strange moments when she swore the radio would flicker to life by itself. Harold, ever the rational man, dismissed it. He told her that isolation made people imagine things, that the wind could sound like a voice if one listened too hard. Still, he started keeping the rifle closer to the door. The children, too, began to act differently. Eleanor told a classmate she'd started hearing footsteps on the roof, even when snow made that impossible. Thomas, who had always been fearless, refused to go near the barn at dusk. He said he saw someone standing there once, someone tall, wearing a hat, who disappeared when he blinked. None of it made sense, and none of it was ever spoken aloud outside the family. In a place as small as Cascade, silence was its own form of protection. By late January, neighbors noticed that Harold had stopped driving into town. Groceries and mail went uncollected. When Ray Wilcox, their nearest neighbor, stopped by to check, Harold politely waved him off from the porch, saying they were keeping to themselves for a bit. From the road, the family still looked normal enough. Margaret hanging laundry, the children shoveling snow, but there was a stillness in their movements that unsettled Ray. It was as if the Jensens were waiting for something, or perhaps dreading it. And then came the night of February 3rd, 1964, the night the wind died, and the valley went completely silent. February 3rd, 1964, was a Monday, the kind of winter day that turned Montana into a white, endless expanse. The air was dry and brittle, the kind that made doors groan in their frames. By dusk, the sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, painting the valley in pale blue shadow. Inside the Jensen farmhouse, a single oil lamp glowed in the kitchen. Margaret moved quietly between the stove and the table, humming under her breath as she ladled gravy into a small ceramic bowl. The smell of roasted beef filled the house, mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplace. Everything about that evening should have been ordinary, familiar. But there was something unspoken in the air, an uneasy stillness that made even the children whisper. Harold sat at the head of the table, shoulders stiff, his eyes flicking occasionally toward the window. Outside, the wind had stopped entirely, which in Montana was strange enough to notice. No howling, no rattle against the roof, just silence, deep, heavy silence. Thomas had been the first to mention it. He said the snow outside wasn't falling right. When his mother asked what he meant, he only shrugged and stared at his plate. Eleanor sat beside him, fidgeting with her fork, glancing toward the hallway where the family radio sat on a small side table. It had been acting strangely all week, turning itself on during the night, tuning to static-filled channels no one recognized. Harold had unplugged it twice, but somehow it always came back on. At 7:15 p.m., Margaret called everyone to sit. The family bowed their heads for grace. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the faint hum of the oil lamp breaking the quiet. As Margaret finished her prayer, a faint pop echoed from somewhere within the walls, like a wire snapping or a fuse burning out. Harold looked up, listening. Then came another sound, a low, warbling tone from the direction of the radio. It was faint, almost too soft to notice at first, but it grew clearer, like a human voice trying to break through static. Thomas froze. Eleanor whispered that she heard someone saying their name. Harold stood, pushing his chair back slightly, and walked toward the hallway. The others stayed at the table. He disappeared around the corner, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the faint scrape of his boots on the wood floor. Then the sound cut off completely. Silence again. Harold didn't call back. When he finally returned, his face had gone pale. He told them the radio was unplugged. But his voice was different, strained, almost shaking. He sat down again, rubbing his temple, muttering something about bad wiring. Margaret tried to restore a sense of normalcy. She passed the bread, asked the children about school, forced a smile. But the air had shifted. Eleanor kept glancing toward the door. Thomas wouldn't eat. The lamp flickered once, briefly, and when it steadied again, the clock had stopped ticking. 7:42 p.m. Harold noticed it, frowned, and reached to wind it, but before he could move, the radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice was unmistakable. Clear, hollow, male. The words came slow, distorted, but everyone at that table heard them. "Don't look." Outside, Margaret gasped. The children froze, and Harold stood halfway out of his chair staring at the darkened window. Then, without warning, the lamp's flame dimmed to a thin thread of light. For a brief moment, the entire house was swallowed in shadow. When the light returned, seconds later, the family was still sitting in their chairs. The food remained untouched. The plates were warm, but the Jensens were gone, silent, unmoving, eyes open, as though something invisible had reached across the table and taken their last breath in unison. It was Ray Wilcox who first noticed something wasn't right the next morning. The smoke that usually rose lazily from the Jensen chimney was still there, too thick, too steady for a family that should have long gone to bed. The air was sharp with frost, the world wrapped in a sheet of still white. Ray bundled himself in his coat, climbed into his truck, and drove the familiar dirt path toward the Jensen place. He'd known Harold for years. They traded tools, shared fence repairs, and sometimes coffee when the weather broke. But as his tires crunched over the frozen ground that morning, a deep unease crept into his chest. When he reached the farmhouse, the first thing he noticed was the truck still parked out front, dusted in snow. The yard looked untouched. No fresh footprints, no sign of movement since the storm the night before. He called out their names. "Harold? Margaret?" His voice swallowed by the still air. No answer came. Only the distant moan of wind through the hollow trees. Ray stepped onto the porch and immediately noticed the smell. Something faintly metallic. Not quite decay, but wrong somehow. The front door wasn't locked, only latched, and when he pushed it open, a dry creak echoed through the house. The warmth hit him first, unnatural for a morning so cold. The fire in the living room was still burning, though low and lazy, as if someone had just fed it hours before. He called out again, his voice trembling slightly this time. No reply. Just that heavy silence that seemed to press down from the ceiling. Then he stepped into the kitchen. The table was perfectly set. Plates of food, the roast still sitting untouched at the center. A fork lay beside Margaret's plate, her napkin folded neatly in her lap. The clock above the mantel had stopped at 7:42 p.m., and around the table sat all 4 members of the Jensen family, upright, still, and lifeless. Ray stumbled backward, his breath catching. He thought at first they were sleeping, or fainted, but there was something horribly deliberate about the way they sat. Heads slightly bowed, hands resting gently on the table. Their eyes were open. Not wide, not panicked, just empty, like they were looking through the world itself. He bolted from the house, nearly slipping on the porch steps, and drove into town faster than he ever had in his life. By noon, the sheriff's department had arrived, followed by the coroner and a few deputies. The scene was unlike anything they had ever encountered. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no overturned furniture. Everything in the house was immaculate. The plates were warm, suggesting the meal had been cooked recently. The coroner checked for gas leaks, for signs of carbon monoxide poisoning, for anything that could explain the stillness, but the readings came back clean. The food itself was tested. No trace of toxins or poison. Their hearts had simply stopped beating. The sheriff, a stoic man named Earl Whitman, had seen his share of grim discoveries, but this one lingered in him. He later told the press, "It looked like they were listening to something, like something came into that room and they knew it was there." The bodies were removed with care, each still sitting in the same upright posture they'd been found in. The roast beef had cooled to stone by the time it was taken for evidence. Even the dog, usually kept outside, was found curled by the back door, dead as well, without injury. When night fell, investigators stood in that silent farmhouse, reluctant to touch anything. The wind had returned, whining softly against the windows. And though they would never admit it in their official reports, more than one deputy swore that as they packed their equipment, the radio in the hallway turned itself on, crackling softly with a faint, distant hum. The investigation into the Jensen family death stretched on for weeks, then months, and with every test that came back empty, the mystery only deepened. Sheriff Earl Whitman, a man not easily shaken, admitted privately that this case unsettled him in ways no murder ever had. There was no crime scene in the traditional sense. No footprints except Ray Wilcox's, no broken glass, no signs of intrusion. The doors were locked from the inside. The only disturbance in the entire house was the stopped clock on the wall and the faint scent of ozone that hung in the air like the aftermath of a lightning strike. The coroner, Dr. William Tate, performed the autopsies himself. He expected to find poisoning, perhaps from contaminated well water or faulty heating, but what he found instead was stranger than fiction. Each member of the family had died almost simultaneously. There were no signs of suffocation, no cardiac disease, no ruptured organs. It was as though every system in their bodies had simply powered down at the same instant, like something invisible had flipped a switch. Even the family dog, found by the back door, exhibited the same symptom. Heart stopped, lungs full, no sign of struggle. The press, hungry for answers, descended on Cascade County. Headlines spoke of the family that died at the table, the Montana mystery, and the frozen dinner. Reporters from Helena and even as far as Chicago flooded the small town, interviewing anyone who had ever spoken to the Jensens. But no one had seen or heard anything unusual that night. No lights in the sky, no strangers on the road, no gunshots or cries for help. The only oddity anyone could agree on was the stillness of the air that evening. Not a single gust of wind crossed the plains. Investigators explored every theory available at the time. The first was gas. Perhaps a carbon monoxide leak had rendered them unconscious. But the old Jensen farmhouse was wood-heated, and every reading showed clean air. Then came the theory of food poisoning, but even after testing, nothing toxic was found in the roast, potatoes, or bread. There was no evidence of chemical contamination, and the well water tested pure. Then came something more unusual, electrical malfunction. Some thought an electrical surge had passed through the house, shocking them, but the lamp had been oil-fueled, and no wiring could have caused synchronized heart failure without leaving burn marks. By late March, desperation had replaced reason. Some townsfolk began whispering about the land itself. Decades earlier, the area had been home to abandoned wartime radio outposts, experimental communication stations rumored to have been used during the Cold War for long-distance frequency testing. A retired engineer from Great Falls came forward claiming that certain frequencies, when amplified, could cause panic or cardiac arrest in animals. He suggested that if an old transmitter had somehow been reactivated, it might explain the strange hum Ray had mentioned hearing when he entered the home. But the theory fell apart when investigators found no equipment in or near the house capable of producing such signals. Others turned to something less scientific. Local ranchers spoke of the land being restless, cursed even. Stories resurfaced of settlers in the 1800s who vanished under similar circumstances. Families found lifeless but untouched, their homes undisturbed. The sheriff dismissed these tales as superstition, but he couldn't shake one detail that bothered him: the expression on their faces. Dr. Tate described it as startled, as if they had seen something, heard something, that had frozen them in that precise instant. The official report concluded that the Jensens had died of undetermined natural causes, but privately, everyone involved knew there was nothing natural about it. Sheriff Whitman stopped giving interviews. Dr. Tate retired within the year, refusing to discuss the case again. And as spring turned the snow to mud, the Jensen farmhouse stood empty, its table still set, a silent monument to a mystery no science could solve. By summer, when the snows finally retreated from the Montana plains, Cascade County was thick with rumors. Official explanations had dried up, and where facts failed, stories grew. People whispered about the government, about Cold War experiments, about the military base an hour south where strange aircraft were sometimes seen at night. Some said the Jensens had stumbled onto something they weren't meant to hear, that the radio transmissions coming through their home weren't simple interference, but encrypted messages bleeding through from some classified program. There were whispers of Project Echo, a rumored communications test rumored to broadcast frequencies that could alter brain function. None of it could be proven, of course, but the very absence of proof made the theories spread faster. A few locals swore that in the weeks before their deaths, Harold had been seen digging trenches near the old windmill behind the house, burying something heavy in the ground. One ranch hand claimed he'd overheard Harold muttering about signals and watchers on the ridge. When questioned, he admitted he might have just been drunk, but the image stuck. What could make a man like Harold Jensen, practical to the bone, bury anything in frozen earth? Margaret's sister, Lillian, wrote to a Helena newspaper insisting that Harold had worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1950s, during a time when the company had collaborated with federal defense projects to test new radio transmitters. She believed he still had equipment left over, metallic parts, maybe even a small generator. She claimed the night they died, Harold had been testing something. Investigators found no such devices when they searched the property, but parts of the basement had caved in over the winter, leaving areas inaccessible without excavation. The county declined to dig. Then came the poison theories. A chemist from Billings wrote an open letter suggesting the family could have been exposed to methyl chloride, a rare but deadly chemical used in old refrigerators. If inhaled in a confined space, it could cause confusion, paralysis, and cardiac arrest without leaving clear traces. For a time, this explanation seemed plausible, until someone pointed out that the Jensens' appliances were electric and modern. The old unit had been replaced the year before. The poison theory, too, collapsed. By autumn, the story had evolved into something else entirely. Churchgoers whispered that Margaret had meddled in things best left alone. A local boy swore he'd seen her walking alone at night near the dry creek bed, clutching what looked like a Bible and muttering under her breath. His mother dismissed it as imagination, but within days, it became another piece of the legend. Margaret Jensen had been protecting her family from something unseen. Then came the stranger stories, those that blurred the line between folklore and fact. A drifter passing through Cascade claimed he'd been near the Jensen property a few nights before their deaths. He said he saw a light hovering above the valley, white and pulsating, unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. Another man swore that when he drove by that same week, his car radio began to emit a shrill tone, words buried deep in static. Stay inside. Even among investigators, there was quiet disagreement. Sheriff Whitman believed the deaths were connected to some undisclosed military experiment. He'd heard rumors of frequency testing that had gone wrong before, cases sealed under national security orders. Others thought it was mass hysteria, a psychological phenomenon triggered by isolation. But for many in Cascade, it wasn't the government or science that explained it. It was the land itself. They said the Jensens had settled too close to an old burial site, that something ancient had been disturbed. The valley had always been avoided by native tribes who claimed the earth there remembered suffering. To them, the Jensens hadn't been victims of human error, but of a presence older and more patient, something that had simply been waiting for silence to return. Every theory contradicted the next, yet all shared one truth. Something about that house didn't fit within the rules of the living. It was late autumn when the Jensen family's cousin, Edward Mullins, came up from Missoula to settle the estate. He was a quiet man in his 40s, soft-spoken, practical, and not prone to superstition. The farmhouse had been boarded up since the spring, dust settling thick over every surface. When he arrived, the sheriff handed him the key and wished him luck, the kind of luck that sounded more like a warning. The town had stopped talking about the Jensens by then, at least in public, but the story lived on in whispers. Children dared each other to ride past the property after dark. Adults avoided the road altogether. Edward had come to collect personal belongings to clear out the home and prepare it for sale. But from the moment he stepped inside, he knew something about the place resisted being disturbed. The air felt cold, stale, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The table still stood where it had that February night, the chairs untouched. The dishes had been removed for evidence, but the circular marks where they'd once sat remained, ghostly outlines in the wood grain. The clock, reset by investigators months earlier, had stopped again, 7:42 p.m. He began upstairs, sorting through drawers, stacking boxes. Most of it was ordinary: wool blankets, worn books, children's toys. But in Margaret's dresser, beneath a bundle of folded linens, Edward found something unexpected: a small leather-bound notebook tied with string. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. It was Margaret's handwriting, neat, deliberate, the kind of script taught in Sunday school. The first entries were domestic notes about meals, church meetings, and household chores. Then slowly, the tone began to change. "Harold says the wind sounds different this week," one line read. "It carries words when it shouldn't." A few days later, "The children keep asking about the man outside. I told them there's no one there, but I saw footprints near the barn. Harold says it's just drifting snow." The entries became increasingly fragmented. "The radio keeps turning itself on. Always the same time. I tried praying, but the sound doesn't stop." Then, a few days before their deaths, "Something's been watching the house again. Last night," the voice said, "don't look outside. Harold says it's just the wind, but I don't think so." That was the final entry. The remaining pages were blank, except for a faint smudge that looked almost like a fingerprint, dark, pressed deep into the paper, as though marked in ash. Edward closed the journal and sat for a long time without moving. He didn't believe in curses or hauntings, but there was something undeniably heavy in the air, a tension that pressed against the back of his neck. He thought he heard a faint hum, distant at first, then clearer. It was coming from the hall, the same hall where the radio had once stood. When he turned the corner, the table was empty, but the cord from the radio dangled across the floor. The plug was still out of the wall, yet the device was on. A low static hiss filled the air, growing sharper, louder, until words began to take shape. Edward could swear it said his name. He yanked the cord and left the house without looking back. When the sheriff arrived later that evening to lock up the property, he found the notebook on the porch open to that final entry. The ink on the last line looked freshly written. No one entered the Jensen farmhouse again after that. The county seized it, boarded it shut, and the key was lost to time. But that journal remained the only clue to what the Jensens might have known, what they might have heard in that quiet, Windswept valley the night they never stood again. Decades have passed since that night in 1964, yet the Jensen farmhouse still stands, tilted slightly to one side, the paint long stripped away by wind and time. It sits on a forgotten stretch of land just outside Cascade, surrounded by the same silent plains that swallowed the sound of their final breaths. Locals say that the house refuses to die, that every attempt to tear it down ends the same way, with the workers leaving before sundown, pale and shaken, claiming the air inside feels too heavy to breathe. Others say that the tools won't work there, that engines stall, batteries die, and wood splinters the moment a hammer strikes. The land itself has changed. Weeds have overrun the yard, wrapping themselves around the porch posts like veins. The barn collapsed years ago during a winter storm, yet the farmhouse remains stubborn and unbroken, the roof sagging but intact. The windows are boarded now, though some boards have rotted away, allowing thin slivers of light to escape at night. Hunters and travelers passing by have sworn they've seen a dim glow coming from the kitchen window, flickering faintly as if from an old oil lamp. But when anyone goes to check, the light vanishes. Over the years, ownership of the property shifted hands several times. The county auctioned it off in the late 1970s to a man from Helena who planned to renovate it. He lasted 3 nights. He told the sheriff he woke up each night at exactly 7:42 to the sound of footsteps pacing above him, steady, measured, like someone walking the length of the hallway. On the 3rd night, the footsteps stopped beside his bed. When he turned on the light, the clock had stopped. 7:42. He left before dawn, abandoning his tools and equipment in the yard. The house returned to silence. Teenagers from Cascade began daring each other to sneak into the property during the 1980s. Some claimed they heard a faint hum coming from the kitchen, others that the smell of roast meat filled the air, even though the stove was long rusted over. One boy said he found 4 chairs in perfect alignment around the table, even though investigators had removed them years before. Another swore he saw shadows seated there, motionless, heads bowed, just before his flashlight went out. When the light came back, the chairs were empty. In 1993, a documentary crew came from Bozeman, hoping to film a short piece on Montana's most enduring unsolved mysteries. They brought cameras, recording equipment, and motion sensors. What they captured was mostly silence, hours of still footage, and a cold wind threading through broken walls. But at exactly 7:42 p.m., every microphone picked up the same sound, a faint rhythmic ticking followed by static. Then, a single whisper impossible to trace or enhance, "Don't look outside." They left that same night and never released the footage publicly. Only one cameraman years later admitted that during playback, he could see faint reflections in the kitchen window. 4 silhouettes seated around a table. Even now, no one lives there. The county long ago stopped trying to sell it. The surrounding land is leased to ranchers who deliberately fence wide around the property, saying their cattle refuse to graze near it. On some nights when the wind dies completely, the valley grows silent again, just as it did that winter evening in 1964. Travelers on the highway say they can see the faint glimmer of light from the farmhouse, steady and soft, as though the family is still sitting down to dinner, waiting for something or someone to finally sit with them. No one knows what really happened to the Jensens. Science failed to explain it, and time only deepened the shadows around their story. The only truth that remains is this. Every year, without fail, on February 3rd at exactly 7:42 p.m., a faint radio signal can still be picked up on shortwave frequencies in the Cascade Valley. Static followed by silence. Then a voice, aged, hollow, almost pleading, saying the same words over and over. "Don't look outside." If you're still here listening in the quiet after the story, then maybe you felt it too, the unease that lingers when the lights fade and something unseen still watches from the dark. The Jensen farmhouse isn't just a story buried in Montana soil. It's a warning, a whisper from the past that refuses to die. But what do you think really happened that night in 1964? Was it madness, revenge, or something that time itself couldn't bury? Tell me your theory in the comments below, your version of the truth. Every story like this hides a detail someone else has missed, and maybe you're the one who can see what the rest of us can't. If you want to keep uncovering these forgotten crimes and haunted histories, those moments where the line between fact and fear blurs, then subscribe before you leave. Because the next story we tell Might be one that still echoes in your own town. Stay curious, stay in the dark, and never ignore the sound that calls your name when no one else is around.